Welcome to Pastor Andrew's Inspirations. Today we will talk about the biblical name of Abihu. In the biblical books, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Abihu or Avihu was one of the two oldest sons of Aaron. According to Leviticus 10, they offered a sacrifice with foreign fire before the Lord, disobeying his instructions, and were immediately consumed by God's fire. Moses instructed Aaron and his family not to mourn, although the people at large were permitted. Abihu was one of the first two sons of Aaron the Levite by his marriage to Elisheba, daughter of Amminadab, from the tribe of Judah. They had 4 sons in total, the younger 2 sons being named Eleazar and Ithamar. During the Exodus journey, after the Israelites' affirmation of their covenant with God, Abihu and his brother accompanied Moses, Aaron, and 70 elders up Mount Sinai. There they saw God with great clarity, walking on a pavement of sapphire stone, and shared a meal in God's presence without being harmed as a result. Aaron and his 4 sons were the first priests appointed as the priestly system was established by God. The Levites as a tribe were later ordained for the priestly service after answering a call to take the Lord's side after the idolatry centered around the golden calf. After the death of Abihu and his brother, Eleazar and Ithamar took their places as priests, because neither Abihu nor his brother had any sons. In Exodus 30 and Leviticus, God outlines a proper sacrifice to him. Aaron the chief priest was to present all offerings representing himself and the people. And Moses said unto Aaron, Go unto the altar and offer thy sin offering and thy burnt offering, and make an atonement for thyself and for the people, and offer the offering of the people, and make an atonement for them, as the Lord commanded. Leviticus chapter 9 verse 7. God would send his own fire to consume the sacrifice as a sign of his presence. When Abihu and his brother lit the offering in the censers themselves, their fire was profane, and thus God was not in it. They prepared an incense offering upon kindling of their own, and not of the holy incense from the sacred bronze altar. This was seen as foreign or unholy fire. Aaron's sons spurned the command to wait for holy fire and offered incense with profane fire. Anyone who altered the sacrificial system assumed a prerogative belonging to God alone. After the death of Abihu and his brother, Moses dictated what was to be done with their bodies. He told Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziel, Aaron's uncle, to carry the bodies away from the sanctuary to a place outside of the camp. He specified for Mishael and Elzaphan to be careful to only touch Abihu and his brother's tunics, and not their bodies. The first concerns in burial were to prevent what is holy from being defiled, and the service of God from being disrupted. The corpses had to be removed immediately, because to allow the uncleanliness of the bodies to remain in the sanctuary could invoke God's wrath again. The bodies were lifted up by their tunics to avoid direct physical contact. This did not prevent the carriers from becoming ritually unclean, but lessened the time and procedures needed to restore them to ritual purity. Aaron and the other surviving priests were commanded not to mourn, participate in mourning rituals, or have contact with the dead. This was applicable not only in this case, but it was modified in any ongoing command. While priests could mourn, they could not have contact with the dead, even a dead spouse, parent, or child, and they could not participate in public mourning rituals. As the representatives of the people, priests were to avoid anything that might disqualify them for God's service. They were to remain ready and able to act in God's service whenever the community needed them. The command not to mourn also applied because the crime of Abihu and his brother was so provoking to God and fully merited the punishment which God had inflicted. To mourn in this case could be seen by the people as accusing God of undue severity. Both the people and the priests needed to show submission to a righteous judgment. If the anointed priests were to sin in this manner, the blame would fall not only upon them, but also upon the people. In addition, all Jews are prohibited from mourning on the Sabbath and during festivals of the Lord. These were days for celebration, not sorrow, is permitted to impinge upon the joy of the days. However, the people in the community as a whole were allowed to mourn and display grief. The people of Abihu, or the death of Abihu and his brother, was tragic yet deserved, and the people were to first recognize that it was deserved and then mourn their death. Abihu and his brother's sin was an encroachment on duties which devolved on their father alone as the high priest. But the offense was of a far more aggravated nature than an encroachment on duties. There were multiple sins contained in one act. First, they ventured unauthorized to perform the incense service, the highest and most solemn of the priest's duties. They also engaged together in a work which was the duty only of one. And thirdly, they presumed to light the fire on the offering themselves. In this respect, they offered foreign fire before the Lord. They were guilty of a presumptuous and unwarranted intrusion into a sacred office which did not belong to them. In these actions, they showed carelessness, irreverence, and a want of faith, lamentable especially for those in the priestly service. A president of such evil tendency was dangerous, and it was imperatively necessary, therefore, as well for the priests themselves, as well as for the sacred things, that God should give a punishment. Whether Abihu and his brother neglected to follow God's outline, sacrificial system of the presumptuousness, or out of thoughtlessness and inattention, their fault was severely punished, so that all might learn to comply exactly with God's commands, and not try to change them or explain them away. The mixing of falsehood with the Word of God was a serious sin. Those in power, like priests, should be especially careful in their behavior, because they are examples to those they serve. The deaths of Abihu and his brother symbolize the death of the ego themselves as burnt offering. In Hebrew, the term burnt offering translates as ascend, so they ascended. The Hebrew noun olah means that which goes up in smoke. It is formed from the active participle of the hifl form of the verb ala, to cause to ascend. Sacrifice with foreign fire is a fire that does not burn, like in chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are consumed with foreign fire in the furnace, fire that doesn't burn the flesh. Being consumed by God's fire means consumed with the Spirit of God, and so they themselves, the ego, died. God would send his own fire spirit to consume and anoint the sacrifice. This is not a physical death of the flesh, but of man's lower nature. They saw God with great clarity and ate in his presence. They both received salvation. Abihu and his brother were in a great position to become honorable and respected priests. If Abihu and his brother's deed had been done through ignorance, they would have been told to bring a sin offering. But instead they did it presumptuously, deliberately and arrogantly, and in contempt of God's majesty and justice. They were therefore cut off, for the wages of sin is death. The sin and punishment of Abihu and his brother showed the imperfection of that priesthood from the very beginning, and that it could not shelter any from the fire of God's wrath. This is the biblical name of Abihu. May God's blessings be upon us all.